The image of the flying man stayed with me since I was a kid, from the time I watched the end of a strange little documentary called Gizmo. Aside from featuring a guy who could vomit kerosene and another guy who could blow up a balloon through his ear, the film dealt primarily with man's failed attempts at flight. There were crude airplanes that people tried to launch off ramps. There were planes that were built to flap like birds. Some were attached to bicycles. Some were even rocket-powered, but the result was always the same. And then finally, at the very end of the film, they showed us what all of those dreamers had been searching for. After 25 years, the images are still with me. Plus, I can use some excitement, so I start looking for a place to learn. There are 3 hang gliding schools within a 2-hour drive of the Washington, D.C. metro area. One of them, located in Manquin, Virginia, says on their website that they use a training method called scooter towing, which, according to the site, eliminates the strenuous climb up the hill associated with traditional training hill instruction. The only thing is, lessons start at 8 a.m., which means I have to be out the door by 6:15. Though they appear simple, successful hang glider designs didn't appear until years after the space age had begun. These manned, controllable aircraft typically weigh around 60 pounds and fold up into a sack hardly wider than a loaf of bread. Using nothing but currents of rising air, hang glider pilots can reach altitudes of more than 20,000 feet and have recorded flights of more than 435 miles. This is the man that many consider to be the great-grandfather of hang gliding. 413 years before the Wright brothers flew over the sand dunes at Kitty Hawk, Leonardo da Vinci was sketching wings based on his studies of bats. He eventually developed a design for a fixed-wing glider that could essentially be worn by the pilot. But although some of his paintings, like Bird's Eye View of a Landscape, suggest otherwise, none of Da Vinci's inventions ever took him into the air. British nobleman and scientist Sir George Cayley was among the first to recognize that a fixed-wing aircraft could fly so long as the wings were cambered to create lift. In 1848, one of his gliders lifted a 10-year-old boy off the ground for short hops of a few yards. 4 years later, Cayley convinced his coachman to pilot a larger, more refined version of his glider. After a wavering, uncontrolled flight of several hundred feet, the coachman reportedly told Cayley, "I wish to give notice, sir. I was hired to drive, not to fly." Despite Cayley's innovations, no real progress was made in glider designs for more than 30 years. Finally, in August 1883, American John Montgomery flew his own glider nearly 600 feet, launching from the hills of Otay Mesa, California. He is credited with having the first ever controlled flights in a heavier-than-air craft. Montgomery continued to improve upon his designs until 1911, when he suffered a fatal crash after stalling less than 20 feet above the ground. Next, we have a man whose birthday will forever be noted in the U.S. Hang Gliding Association's calendar. As a teenager in northeast Germany, Otto Lilienthal built wings of birch and canvas and tried flapping them while running down hills, perhaps not unlike one of the would-be flyers from Gizmo. But Lilienthal grew up to be an engineer, and he intently studied the research left behind by Sir George Cayley. By the early 1890s, Lilienthal had developed cloth-covered wings that flew him across his garden. By 1894, with an improved glider, Otto was making flights longer than 150 feet from a hill he created near his home in Berlin. He made more than 2,000 flights from this hill, gaining worldwide notoriety in the process. Lilienthal's glider was controlled by the movement of his lower body to shift the center of gravity during flight. He was attached to the glider by nothing more than arm loops from which the rest of his body hung, hence the eventual name of this type of flight, hang gliding. Over the next couple of years, Otto Lilienthal had flights on this glider that went as far as 1,100 feet. But on August 8, 1896, a gust of wind threw his glider out of control, and he died the day after the crash. According to legend, his last words were, "Sacrifices must be made. The dream has begun. Carry on." "Sacrifices must be made" is written on Otto's gravestone. However, the curators of the Otto Lilienthal Museum in Anklam, Germany, told me that Lilienthal's assistant reported that following the crash, Otto was apparently unaware of the seriousness of his injuries. According to the assistant, Lilienthal's last words were, "I have to rest a little bit, and then we can continue." But there is no minimizing Otto's contributions. Lilienthal freely shared his flight designs with Octave Chanute, a civil engineer living in America. Chanute, in turn, built his own gliders and flew them over the sand dunes near Lake Michigan. On May 13, 1900, Wilbur Wright contacted Chanute, the first of more than 430 letters that would pass between the Wright brothers and the older engineer. After building a series of their own gliders, the two brothers added an engine, and on December 17, 1903, they showed the world that powered, controlled flight had at last arrived. With the realization of powered flight, gliders like those of Chanute and Lilienthal were largely forgotten. Decades would pass, and ultimately it would take the genius of a NASA engineer and the innovations of an Australian water skier to both resurrect and redefine hang gliding. As a child growing up near the coastal mountains of Northern California, Francis Regallo was an avid kite flyer. Before long, he was building his own kites, using raw materials like newspaper and wood from packing crates. Neither young Francis nor the other children he flew kites with would likely have believed that one day Francis Regallo would build a kite that would change aviation forever. Regallo went on to earn one of the first aeronautical engineering degrees ever issued within the U.S. at Stanford University in 1935. He was appointed to a research position at the Langley Laboratory of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, in Hampton, Virginia. Though he excelled at Langley, he found little satisfaction in designing large, high-speed aircraft that only the government could use. And so, away from work, Francis Regallo returned to his boyhood passion of kite building. But after years of training in aeronautics and aerodynamics, the kite designs of the last few centuries were no longer good enough. It was around that time that Regallo had the idea for what he called a flexible wing, an airfoil that used the force of the air itself to retain its shape. He eventually created a cloth model that his wife, Gertrude, sewed from the same fabric used for their kitchen curtains. With the success of that design, Regallo asked his superiors at Langley if they had any interest in his new flexible wing.
Langley Research Center there just didn't have any interest in it at all. But they said that I could feel free to do it at home on my own. And of course, I really had to get their permission, because working for them, while anything I did aeronautically belonged to them.
Denied the resources of Langley, Regallo built a makeshift wind tunnel with a 36-inch fan in his home in which to test his ever-improving flexible wing designs. In 1948, he registered the patent for his flexible kite in his wife's name. Packaged in a tube and sold under the name FlexiKite, the design sold fairly well as a toy.
In 1952, we licensed company up in Connecticut to manufacture these kites, and they made them just like we made them, but they put them in this tube. And they sold about 7,000 of them, I think.
Finally, after more than 10 years, Regallo's employers began to listen to his suggestions that the flexible wing had more potential than its use as a plaything. Their change in mindset came shortly after the launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957 and the start of the space race. Within a year, NACA had been absorbed by the newly created National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which now attempted to find ways of returning capsules safely from orbit. In 1960, the first director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, Werner von Braun, visited Langley to discuss the potential of the flexible wing as a means of returning spent rocket boosters to dry land. Regallo gave von Braun a demonstration of a flexible wing model, the same model he demonstrated for me in his living room more than 40 years later. Suddenly, Regallo was able to test his flexible wings in the world's largest wind tunnels, as NASA began an extensive series of tests to determine the ways in which the wing could be used. Variations of the wing were developed that included stiff leading edges. In some of these tests, the leading edges were inflated once the wing was released. During one demonstration, spectators at an air show were amazed when the flexible wing stayed aloft much longer than expected, circling and gliding on currents of rising air. The implications were enormous. The capability for non-powered flight had been available to mankind for thousands of years. The cloth and rope in use by the ancient Egyptians would have been sufficient to develop a flexible wing. Aside from being a way to potentially return capsules and boosters to land, Regallo's wing was also viewed by NASA as a way to drop off and transport cargo. Jeeps and other vehicles could be towed behind planes, or supplies could be dropped off and directed to precise locations. At the culmination of these cargo tests, a 3-ton load was attached to the wing and dropped from high altitude. A series of timed detonations unfolded the wing, section by section, until it stretched more than 70 feet from tip to tip. As these tests were being conducted, NASA gave Regallo permission to publish details on the non-military aspects of his experiments. Immediately, ambitious souls with a burning urge to fly used Regallo's reports to construct their own flexible wings. One of the first was University of California student Barry Hill Palmer, shown here in 1961 with a Regallo wing built from bamboo and cellophane. Like Otto Lilienthal nearly 70 years before, Palmer hung by his arms and steered the wing by shifting his lower body. It was around that time that the U.S. government began using aerospace contractors to continue tests with Regallo's flexible wing designs. One of those contractors, the Ryan Aeronautical Company, created a manned version of the wing with a tricycle landing configuration and a control stick. This vehicle was towed behind an airplane and glided back down to Earth after being released. NASA ultimately abandoned the idea of using the flexible wing to return rocket boosters or transport cargo. But while tests continued, the aerospace contractors, like Regallo, were permitted to publish their findings. And hidden away in magazines like the November 1961 issue of Popular Mechanics, with its cover story on how to build your own car wash, were articles that would start a revolution in personal flight. Like Barry Hill Palmer in California, Tom Purcell Jr. created his own model of Regallo's wing design in North Carolina. Purcell came up with two versions. One was towed up to altitude over land by a car. The second had floats and was towed behind a boat. America was now represented by creative pilots using the flexible wing on both coasts. However, the innovations that would take Regallo's wing toward hang gliding as we know it today were about to happen on the other side of the world. In the early 1960s, Australian John Dickinson was a member of the Grafton Waterski Club in New South Wales. His passion for aviation was well known by his fellow club members, as they were used to seeing him flying about in his modified gyrocopter. That made Dickinson the club's resident aeronautical expert, and one day his fellow skiers approached him with an assignment. The annual Jacaranda Carnival, held on the Clarence River, was again on its way. Organized by the Grafton Waterski Club, the day's exhibitions included ski jumps and slalom races. But to the crowds that the carnival always drew, the greatest spectacle was watching the club's members try to fly their flat ski kites. Flown by the club's more daring members, these kites were hardly more aerodynamic than a tilted hand stuck out a moving car window. And if the tow line pressure diminished even for an instant, both the kite and skier literally fell from the sky. To the delight of the crowds, virtually every skier who had flown a flat kite at earlier Jacaranda carnivals had been in a spectacular crash. John Dickinson's assignment was to build a better ski kite. He came up with several different designs, but wasn't satisfied with any of them. Then, like Barry Hill Palmer and Tom Purcell, Dickinson came upon a magazine photo that would change everything. But he needed a model for water skiers, one that could be easily controlled by the pilot while getting up to speed, while being towed into the air, and most importantly, after release from the tow line or in the event that the line went slack. He obsessed over the control issue for nearly 4 months before he found the answer.
I was watching my daughter swinging. I was swinging her in a park in Grafton, and I thought there's the answer: separate the body away from the kite, connect it as a single point, and by adjusting the length of the control arm, then I would have full control over the glider, because it's mainly just you're using your weight to gain leverage through the handlebar. I conceived that at the same time that if we had a lever, then I could control the angle of attack of the glider. And then, of course, it naturally followed that if you could do that backwards and forwards for up and down, if you moved it left and right, you had control of the right and left. Ergo, three-axis control.
This is one of the first pictures ever taken of Dickinson's new ski wing, as he called it, only a few days after its first flight in September 1963. Grafton Waterski Club member Rod Fuller is the pilot. Here you can see the two innovations that Dickinson was responsible for and that are still in use today. Here is the single weight shift connection point attached at the glider's center of gravity, or CG. And here is the lever, which would later be known as the A-frame control bar, and now simply as the control bar, that allows the pilot to shift his weight, and along with it, the glider's CG.
It flew first time with, well, it didn't fly first time actually. I had a centre of gravity adjustment down the keel, and I took it out to fly it, and the centre of gravity adjustment was too far forward, and it skied 2 or 3 miles, and we couldn't get it into the air. We returned to the beach, and the centre of gravity adjustment was moved to where I'd actually calculated it to be. And then another pilot, a very big guy, about 6'4", very heavily built. He said, "Let me fly the thing." He got all set, did a jump start, and went straight up in the air 80 feet, and pulled the bar to his chest. And of course, it was just as sensitive as a modern glider, and it came straight down 80 feet into the water, and gave him such a hell of a shake-up. He never so much as handled the glider again. We got our club top skier, a fellow called Rod Fuller. He took the control. He obviously learned from our mistakes and got them to slowly accelerate it, and then gently lifted him off the water. And he flew for about 4 miles, I suppose, and returned to the beach. The rope was sort of let loose, and he glided into the beach complete with glider and all. And I then took the glider and flew it myself. And I mean, I was how excited can one get over something that you've conceived? club had about 80 members, and there were only two people who got hooked on it, and it was Rod Fuller and myself. And we, every weekend, Saturday and Sunday, would fly the glider. We did this up to the time of the water ski festival in November. And of course, the whole thing just went so perfectly that everyone was terribly disappointed. This kite took off under control, flew around the circuit under control, and was landed under control.
Throughout 1964 and into 1965, Dickinson and Fuller generated publicity for the ski wing by flying exhibitions outside of Grafton. Dickinson formed a partnership with a company in Sydney that built and sold the ski wing, while he offered demonstrations and instruction. But in a decision that would later haunt him, while Dickinson received a provisional patent for his ski wing design, he did not secure a permanent patent when the opportunity came.
Finally, the papers came through to complete the patent, and I didn't have the money to do it, and I just had to let it lapse, much to my chagrin at this point in time. I mean, I'm on a government pension now. It would have been worth, I estimate, more than 15 million if I'd have been able to complete the patent.
By 1965, we had the offspring of Francis Regallo and John Dickinson, a wing that was in most ways identical to what hang glider pilots would be flying for the next 10 years. But in 1965, the sport of hang gliding still didn't officially exist. How did the ski wing come to being run off hills by eager pilots in Australia, across Europe, and in the US? Look up Fearless in the dictionary, and you may find references to the names Moyes and Bennett. Like Dickinson, Australians Bill Moyes and Bill Bennett were competitive water skiers and friendly rivals. Both had tried flying the notoriously unstable flat kites behind speedboats. And in 1966, when Dickinson received some press for a 2-hour towed ski wing flight on the Hawkesbury River on the outskirts of Sydney, Moyes and Bennett, both Sydney residents, heard about it. Within a year, they were not only expert pilots on the ski wing, they had begun modifying and selling their own gliders. Both Moyes and Bennett clearly realized the commercial potential of these wings, and from the outset dedicated themselves to their promotion. Their exploits became a continual seesaw of one-upsmanship.
He would fly to 500 feet, and I'd go to 6. He'd go to 750, and I'd go to 1,000. You know, he'd fly 2 miles, and I'd fly 5 miles. It was just a matter of one person waiting to see what the other one did, to see how he could outperform it or something. See, wherever Bill and I went, whatever we did, we were setting a world record. That's easy when nobody else has ever done it. You jump 2 feet, nobody ever jumped 2 feet, so it's a world record. Next week you do 3 feet and 4 feet and so on. Well, eventually he went up and towed up to 10,000 feet or something, and I had to go up on a hot air balloon to get higher than that, you know.
In 1969, Bill Bennett set out to conquer the United States by way of California. Bill Moyes, though he spent several years flying the ski wing for crowds across the US and Europe, stayed in Australia. His company, Moyes Delta Gliders, remains one of the largest hang gliding manufacturers in the world. Bennett set up his own company, Delta Wing Kites, in Van Nuys. Though adventurous young souls like Barry Hill Palmer and fellow Californian Richard Miller were already running their own Regallo wing variations off of hills, Bill Bennett is considered to be the first person to ever fly a Regallo wing with John Dickinson's control design in the United States. And it was only a few months after arriving in the US that Bennett would perform the stunt he would always be best known for.
I thought, what a neat thing to do on the 4th of July would be to fly over the Statue of Land on Liberty Island, you know. So we went up there and went up the Hudson all the way from Perth Amboy and put the glider together and got in the water at Ellis Island and towed up 1,000 feet or so, cut loose, flew around the statue and landed on Liberty Island. The harbour policeman was extremely nice. I'd landed and I was just standing on the grass and he came up and he said, "Is your name Bill Bennett?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Now I want you to shut up, say nothing and listen to me, okay?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, now I hear that you're going to fly over and around the statue and land on the island. And I opened my mouth and he said, remember what I told you? Keep quiet. He said, now my advice to you, young man, is to pack up your tent and steal into the night. I said, yes, sir. Goodbye. People say, well, how do you ever get permission to do these things? Well, of course you don't. It's much easier to be forgiven than it is to get permission.
The promotion of this new extreme activity by Bennett and Moyes and the competition between the two flyers continued, and it wasn't long before Bill Moyes had his own brush with authorities.
Bill Bennett had short-circuited a couple of things that I had planned here, and he made a noise about going to jump into the Grand Canyon. So I thought, well, I'll steal it off him, and I did. I went there looking at the site, and I was dropping little paper parachutes over the edge to see how the air was flying. And one of the rangers said, what are you doing? I said, oh, I'm going to jump off here with a kite. And he said, you are not. This is a national park. This is not a place for a circus. You'll fall down there and kill yourself. We're going to risk our lives coming down there to get you. So he embarrassed me pretty much. And I thought, well, he's probably right. I'll pack up. Anyhow, just as I was about to turn and walk away, he said, anyhow, I don't believe you could do it. So that reversed the whole thing. I had to do it then. So I left, and then I flew back in the night with a small kite that I could break down and put in a small Cessna. I came back with a buddy and a film crew, and they changed the rangers down there in the early hours of the morning. And they were coming out with a buddy helicopter just as I was coming down, and we passed each other. And they hovered around and watched me land, and then they went back and sent down rangers to arrest us. They locked us up. We spent a couple of days and had a bit of money in jail, and were fined for. They didn't fine me for flying into the Grand Canyon. They fined me for filming without a permit. Because had they fined me for flying, that meant they would admit that it happened. So they denied it happened. When the newspapers called, they said, no, we caught him at the top. But fortunately, we buried a roll of film down the bottom. They didn't want other people. You Americans are quite crazy. They tell me that if one successful flight would have people there arriving with sheets and poles and jumping over the damn thing, and they were probably right.
For Bill Bennett, the only logical response was to jump into Death Valley in 1971. And by this time, Hollywood was starting to notice. Bennett was featured on Thrill Seekers, a television show hosted by Chuck Connors. And in 1972, one of Bennett's Delta Wing kites proved itself as a reliable, stealthy way for James Bond to drop into Mr. Big's hideout. But it may shock you to learn that it wasn't Roger Moore being towed far above the waters of Jamaica. It was Bennett. But perhaps the greatest feat ever accomplished by Bill Bennett or Bill Moyes was simply the fact that they survived. Their stunts were performed before the days of harnesses or emergency parachutes. They flew thousands of feet in the air in kites that were still being tried and tested, held up only by their plastic seats.
Next time you go back and do the same show again, you've got to do it higher and faster. You can't sell the same act. So trying to go too fast, we were breaking ropes and the gliders were tumbling over backwards. Their early regalias, when we pulled them hard, they pitched nose up and they climbed rapidly, but the nose kept pitching up when the toe force went. If you broke anything, then you immediately looped and then fell back into it. So I had 5 of those. Up there in North Dakota, I had a good one in Jamestown. I fell 400 feet, broke me pelvis and ribs and teeth and a few other things, split me liver. Another one in Melbourne, I did the same thing again. I broke an arm in Denmark.
I flew in Melbourne on the Yarra River. There's a photographer there saying, how do you know you're going to land where you think? I said, look, we always land where we say we're going to land. But how do you know that? I said, because we always do it. And that's where I'm going to land, up there, right? He said, oh, all right. And sure enough, he wandered off up to where I was going to land. And then I came down short and landed in a palm tree and broke my wrist. Another time I took off and the wind gave me a big old ground loop. It really did a good job on me and slammed me back over into the side of the mountain, and they helicoptered me out with a broken back. We've survived things that were probably much more severe than things that caused people their demise, you know? I guess it's all a matter of just not being your time yet. We agreed that the last man alive is the winner.
But Moyes and Bennett accomplished what they set out to do, introduce this new sport to the world. And in 1971, on Otto Lilienthal's birthday, a group of Californians brought their foot-launched glider designs to an anonymous hill in Orange County. It is considered by many to be the day when hang gliding became a sport. An article in Sports Illustrated in December 1973, followed 2 months later by one in Reader's Digest called "The Flyingest Flying There Is," made hang gliding's place in American culture official. After an hour and 40 minutes, we're at Manquin Flight Park, home to Blue Sky hang gliding. Manquin Flight Park is 180 acres of fields, a 1.1-mile road for truck towing, and 2 intersecting grass runways. In addition to the flight park, the landowners lease to farmers who grow soybeans in this field and alfalfa in this field. Though landing anywhere on the fields is fair game, most of the ground-level activity takes place within this section, where the glider setup area, hangars, trailers, picnic tables, and spectator area are located. Steve Wendt, Blue Sky's owner, operator, and instructor, lives here with his cat, Java. He's been flying hang gliders since the mid-1970s.
I got started on my own, kind of as a rebellious thing to my parents not wanting me to race motorcycles anymore. They made me sell it, and I just kind of was interested in flying all along. This was in 1975, and I ordered a hang glider through the mail. It was a kit, $400, and it had a little book that said how to fly. The book was just a little pamphlet that gave you the how-tos on putting it together and the basics of running a glider down a hill into the wind and flying, and I really didn't have much to compare it to. It was an original standard Regalo, and if I ever got more than 30 or 40 feet off the ground, that's probably all I ever did with it. In fact, it scared me more than anything else at times. And they were just finally upgrading gliders to where they started to have a little wider nose angle, and finally they came out with battens in the sail and different things like that that made it perform better. And gliders were evolving so quickly at that point, you know, into the early 80s. It seemed like every year there was something so new to fly that worked so much better. It was worth moving into that new equipment.
And glider designs have continued to evolve into remarkable pieces of engineering. Though Dickinson's A-frame control bar and central weight shift point are still pretty much universal, modern hang gliders look a lot different from those being flown in the 60s and early 70s. Virtually every part of their design is dedicated to either strength or flight stability.
To make a glider stable and roll, gliders have what's called dihedral, where the wingtips are raised slightly above the root, and the raising of those tips gives the glider stability and roll. A flat wing is going to produce more lift than a tilted wing. If we have our wings tilted upward and the glider gets bumped into a turn, now my left wing is flat, my right wing is banked upward, my left wing is producing more lift, and it tries to right itself. So a stable glider has a little dihedral, and every time it gets bumped into a turn, the lower wing tends to want to lift more and right itself. We've got improved stability and pitch by sweeping the wings back and having a lower angle of attack, or twist, sometimes called washout, along the trailing edge of the wing. So by bringing in sweep and twist, we provide pitch stability to the gliders, and by having dihedral, we have roll-controlled stability in each glider. And every glider is a little different based upon what the glider's been designed to do.
There is a wide spectrum of glider designs to choose from based on pilot skill level. This beginner glider has a wide nose angle for added stability. It also has what's known as a single surface sail, which means that the sail area ends at the glider's leading edge. Compare this with a more advanced model with a double surface sail that wraps around the leading edge and runs all the way back. This makes the glider much faster and allows it to penetrate stronger winds. This glider is also topless, which means that it doesn't have the king post associated with most other models. Topless gliders are high performance and relatively new, first appearing in the mid-1990s. So how does a ready-to-fly hang glider come out of one of these 20-foot-long bags? It usually takes 15 to 20 minutes, but Holly will help us speed through. First, we put together the A-frame control bar by attaching the bottom segment, called the base tube, to the ends of the two down tubes. Next, we'll turn the glider upright and take off the bag. After removing some Velcro straps, the wings get spread apart. In the case of this Moy's Sonic model, spreading the wings automatically raises the king post, to which Holly attaches the rear wires, known as reflex bridles. Next, before the sail is tensioned, we insert thin aluminum tubes called battens into their appropriate sleeves. The battens hold the sail into the optimum cambered shape for flight and are usually held in place by an elastic cord. There are usually about 5 or 6 battens in each wing. Before putting the last few battens in place, we tension the sail by locking this cable into place on the keel. Tensioning the sail fully spreads the wings and lifts the wingtips off the ground. Once we take the wingtip bags off, we can slide the last battens in, including a couple that get inserted underneath the wings. A careful check to make sure everything's in place, and that's it. With nothing but flat fields making up Manquin Flight Park, foot launching isn't an option to get gliders into the air. Instead, Blue Sky uses truck towing, in which the glider is pulled up behind a truck with a payout winch, typically reaching between 1,000 and 2,000 feet before the pilot detaches. Or there's aero towing, where the pilot is towed behind an ultralight and releases at around 2,500 feet. More on those later. The scooter towing that I had read about on Blue Sky's website is a way to get student pilots into the air for short flights. Instead of being pulled across the field behind a scooter, as I thought might be the case, a mutated 50cc scooter sits atop a stationary mount. The scooter's rear wheel has been replaced with an intake spool for the tow line, which runs about 1,000 feet down the field, reaches a pulley anchored into the ground, and comes back to attach to both the glider and the student's harness. By revving the throttle, Steve can control how much pull and resulting lift the student receives, which lets Steve back off accordingly if he sees the student doing something inappropriate. For example,
All right, look ahead, square. One step won't do it. You're gonna have to run. Now there you kind of took a step and then fell over. We gotta run.
Ideally, a scooter tow student should fly down the length of the field, hit the release lever, which looks like a bicycle brake, and come in for a graceful landing. Landings can be a bit tough. As the pilot approaches the ground, they need to push out on the glider's down tubes, which shifts the pilot's weight backward and raises the glider's nose. Known as flaring the glider, or just a flare, the idea is to stall the glider at roughly the same moment the pilot's feet reach the ground. When performed by an experienced pilot, the flare is a work of art. Of course, things don't always go so smoothly. It usually takes 7 or 8 scooter tow lessons, with the student getting about 8 flights per lesson before graduating to their first truck tow. It's what every student at Blue Sky is working toward, and ultimately, it's Steve's decision as to whether or not you're ready. The day I arrived for my first lesson, Zelda is on her 4th. She's still having a bit of trouble, though, particularly on launches.
My right wing was down low, and I think I'm not sure if I ran enough, but just happened. Let's try again.
What you want to do is you want to get that glider on your shoulders, and that glider should stay right on your shoulders as you start to run so that it doesn't fall off your shoulders, and then it'll lift off when it has speed. But one of the things that's happening is your body's going forward, the glider falls off your shoulders and slides down your arms, and it isn't flying yet. And if it falls off there one side before the other, you're in a turn already. And I believe that's a little bit of what's happening to us right there, okay?
I have a 13-year-old daughter, and she's like, "Ma, you're nuts, you're crazy." And my mother thinks I'm absolutely nutso, you know. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? But that's all right. I've never been really good at any sport. I mean, I could, you know, I've swam and I can, you know, I've run and I've done, you know, gymnastics and done, you know, things, but never to any kind of perfection. Never something that's gone the limit. And I think I could do this one. It'll be fun.
Same thing. You're not keeping the glider on your shoulders long enough to get it flying so it's falling off your shoulders and has no directional control whatsoever. Go ahead and scream for me, Zelda. Let me hear it. There you go.
Maybe. Do that again.
The concept of shifting your own weight to control both the roll and pitch of the glider takes some getting used to, and a lot of beginning students have trouble with it. Here, on a simulator built next to the hangars, Steve offers first-time students a basic idea of weight shift.
Now, for left and right, we go in the direction that we move our body in the direction that we wish to go. If I want to make a right-hand correction, I want to simply pull my body to the right. Don't lean your head to the right. That won't work, no matter how big your head is. If your head's a 50-pound head, this won't help. It's all in the hips. You got good hips? All right. So if you can do this, you know, wiggle your hips, you'll get control out of that glider because that's where all your weight is.
The mistake of leaning instead of shifting your weight that Steve warned against is a classic error in learning to fly a hang glider. It's called cross-controlling. The pilot wants to turn in a certain direction, so they grab the control frame and pull their upper body that way. But when they do, their hips and most of their weight get rotated in the opposite direction, and the glider responds accordingly, doing the exact opposite of what the pilot wants. Another common mistake is letting the glider fly too slow during approach to landing. Like any aircraft, flying slow puts less air over the wing surface, and the controls become mushy and unresponsive. The worst time to do this with a hang glider is on approach to landing, when you need it to respond quickly to corrections. This pilot is on his 8th lesson and is awaiting Steve's approval to graduate to his first truck tow.
Get slow! That's why he's not on the truck. He does things like that.
The last time I looked at you, man, you were way out of the bar. I'm like, man, you can't have the bar out like that. And you were like still 15 feet off the ground with the bar here, and there's nothing left. I mean, you gotta have speed. If anything, you need to be pulling in that last, you know, quarter of your flight and have good speed. Your flight, you're not going to get as long of a flight, it's not going to fly farther, but you'll have good energy and ground effect for your flare.
This is Tex Forrest, Blue Sky's only employee other than Steve. If you're visiting Blue Sky and want to get a real taste of hang gliding without taking any lessons, Tex is the one who will take you up 2,500 feet in the tandem glider.
Whatever you did, kind of remember the negative side to it, and just that, yeah, just because right now you're at a stage where instructors, we're all looking for consistency. Right. You know, you can't have 3 good ones and then 1 crappy one. They all have to be good now. And until they are like that, I mean, that's the, you know, you're another lesson away from the truck. I was 23, down at the beach with some of my buddies from school, and we were camping out, and there a whole week at the beach, and run out of things to do. We jet skied one day we went hiking, you know, and then it's like, hey, let's go hang gliding tomorrow. Okay, they got a school here, and I tried it, and boom. I mean, I'd flown in aircraft before, jets and things like people travel, but never like that. It was like you would fly in your dreams, how you would run and just lift off the ground, and that was it for me at that moment. I knew this was a sport I wanted to pursue.
Tex is also the illustrator for the U.S. Hang Gliding Association's calendar, but he's more well known among local pilots for his Airheads series, a collection of drawings he did while serving as editor of the Capital Hang Gliding Association's newsletter in the early 90s. There's an airhead for every occasion, like this one paying tribute to the Regalo wing designs of the early 1970s. Here's one that caused a bit of controversy for the Capital Hang Gliding Association.
I always wanted to make a bumper sticker like that. Hang glider pilots are well hung. And yeah, put that on the bumper. I did them too, I think, because people were taking this sport so seriously, and you should, but sometimes, you know, you got to be able to, like, laugh at things too, and I think it was, like, just that little lighter side of it, you know? It's like, geez, you can't take things so seriously that it's not fun anymore.
When Tex teaches through a tandem flight, it is done on this glider, designed specifically for two people. It has landing gear to remove the issue of running to a stop on landing.
You get the girls that scream and they're excited, and you get guys that, you know, their eyes bulge out. I mean, it's just sometimes when you take them up for their very first time and they have no idea what it's going to be like, and you take them up there and it's just like, wow, that sense of wonderment. It's always amazing. I gotta get this harness up, get a strap over my big ass. Oh, yeah. Okay, coming down, ready? We had one young kid that came here. He's probably in his early teens, maybe 13 or 14, and he was on the ground all cocky and talking big and everything, and hooked him in a hang glider, and boy, as soon as we left the ground, he just was like scared to death. You could see his lip quivering, and he was just like, and we got up maybe 300 feet, 400 feet, and I just said, "Are you all right?" And he wasn't saying anything, and I kept saying, "Are you okay?" And all of a sudden he just said, "I'm really scared. I'm really scared." And I said, "Well, do you want me to land?" He goes, "I want to get on the ground." He just like had a panic attack, and I pulled the release, and you know, I got down as fast as I could, and the guy was scared to death. And as soon as we hit the ground, he was like back to being himself again. The guy hopped out, and he was just like, "Oh yeah, man, that was cool. It was fun," you know. And it was just so funny to see that from my perspective, and his friends had no clue, you know. And I told him, I said, "Hey, this is our secret, you know, I won't tell him." And he's like, "Oh, thanks," you know.
By my fifth lesson, Steve and Tex are recommending that I sign up for a tandem flight myself. Steve tells me I'm a couple of lessons from soloing off the truck, and he wants to be sure I won't be overwhelmed by the altitude. Zelda, meanwhile, is still having trouble. She's now on her 11th lesson.
It's been a long summer, really, frustrated sometimes, kind of moving 3 steps forward and then, just having to think about what I'm doing. I think it's a really, it's a sport that you really have to concentrate on and really think about what you're doing all the time, not to make any bad decisions.
Don't go here and try to pull it in, and don't go here when you let go. Just turn your hands and let it out your hand. Right? Okay. That would help.
There was one lesson that I drove back to Winchester, and I hardly said anything. I was so discouraged. I was so frustrated. It was just a bad, I don't know, a bad time. I think it's a great sport. I really have this ambition and this, feeling that I can do it now. And I would really like to just accomplish it. I think it'd be a great accomplishment for myself.
Tex, you got any more of that magic sleeping powder we can give her?
Oh, the relaxing powder? I think it's like a beer and a half, maybe.
A beer and a half?
I think that'll be her requirement for every lesson. Just have a beer.
Right on cue, the air calms down at about 5 o'clock that afternoon, and the conditions are perfect for my tandem flight. The tandem glider, which is manufactured under the name Double Vision, has 2 harnesses that hang side by side. The straps for each harness connect to a steel carabiner, which in turn connects to what is called a hang loop, the nylon strap that wraps around the glider's center of gravity at the keel. I walk around the glider looking for anything that might be out of place, but I'm not sure I'd know the difference. We're going to be aerotowed, that is, pulled up behind this ultralight, which is also known as the tug plane. The tug plane has a 65 horsepower engine and weighs about 400 pounds with a full tank of gas. The tug will pull us behind 200 feet of this plastic line, which is called Spectra. The Spectra line used at Blue Sky for scooter towing, aero towing, and truck towing has a test strength of 1,200 pounds at just over 1/5 of an inch thick. But to make sure that the tug plane doesn't drag us against our will through the sky or into the ground, we won't connect to the spectra directly. The line extends from the tug plane to an aluminum carabiner through which runs a nylon rope that in turn attaches to two places: Tex's harness, where he has a secondary release, and up to the main aerotow release, which is activated by squeezing the same bicycle brake handle used in scooter tows. The rope connects to this release by a thin cord called the weak link, which breaks at about 120 pounds. If the forces during tow exceed that, the weak link will break and the tug plane and glider will separate. This setup is the same one used for single pilot aerotows, although without the landing gear of the double vision, gliders are instead launched off a wheeled cart that is left behind when they get airborne. Finally we're ready, and the ultralight's engine roars into full power. The ground speed is a lot faster than I'm used to on the scooter tows, about 35 miles an hour, and I wonder how easily the double vision can handle it. Tex isn't concerned. The ground falls away, and away, and away. After only a minute or so, I ask Tex how high we are, trying to sound nonchalant. "Ah, heck," he says. "Maybe 400, 450. And as we continued to climb, it all became clear to me, this sport that I had dedicated my last 5 weekends and much of my free thought to. It wasn't about running off gently sloped training hills or practicing your moves in the simulator. It wasn't about getting towed 30 feet above a field by a scooter with a modified rear wheel. What I had been taking lessons for was hang gliding, getting up as high as possible for as long as possible, hanging by a nylon strap from a 60-pound fabrication of aluminum tubes and Dacron sheets. Hang gliding's reputation as an extreme sport was not given to it as a result of scooter tows. And at 2,300 feet, the enormity of what we were doing pressed down upon me. The ultralight floated 200 feet in front of us, suspended in ethereal nothingness by nothingness, the spectral line barely visible where it reached the tug plane's tail. And beneath us, the roads that I had traveled so enthusiastically to get here, to take up this sport. The tug pilot signals for our release and Tex squeezes the handle. The ultralight speeds away, and suddenly the only sound is the gentle rush of wind over the double vision sail. Ground speed at this height is impossible to gauge. It's like we're simply suspended in space. The tallest buildings in the world, the Petronas Towers in Malaysia, stand 1,483 feet. We're 1,000 feet higher. Should my hang loop fail, I would fall for nearly 15 seconds before hitting the ground at about 130 miles an hour. I ask Tex about the strength of the hang loop, and he tells me, "Good God, man, hang loops could pick up a car." After a pause, he asks me if I'm okay. "Yeah," I tell him. But suddenly, one of his airhead illustrations makes perfect sense to me. He lets me take the controls, and for the next 10 minutes we practice turns. It's a little more challenging because I have to move his weight as well as mine. We even try a stall where the nose is gradually pushed out until the glider stops flying. There's a quick feeling of a roller coaster on a hill, and we lose about 40 feet of altitude before the glider recovers. I'm glad when we're finally on our approach to landing. This first flight has left me a bit overwhelmed. If I had taken this tandem before I had gone through so many lessons, I might not have continued. But as it is, I have too much time invested to give up now. I'm even starting to pick up some of the hang gliding slang after spending the last several weekends here with the pilots. For instance, a WAFO, an abbreviation for "what's that for?" is a clueless spectator who frustrates a hang glider pilot with an endless barrage of questions. Washing your face means flying through a cloud. Specking out refers to getting so high that to those on the ground, you are literally a speck. A spud is a pilot who holds others up by waiting too long prior to launch. A whack is used to describe any bad landing, and landings are always open for critique by any of the pilots inevitably watching.
Put your hands up. Put your hands up. Too late.
Oh!
His hands were right here.
Yeah.
You could never even flare from there.
A beak is a type of whack where the glider's nose touches the ground, something that, in theory, should never happen. Beaking it is when the glider's nose slams hard into the ground. And perhaps the most embarrassing whack of all, a turtle, where the glider flips and the king post touches the ground. So in a sport where slang for bad landings is used regularly, just how dangerous is the sport of hang gliding? The early to mid 1970s is when hang gliding picked up its high-risk reputation, and back then it was well-deserved. As word following the first Lilienthal meet spread, dozens of companies sprang up that began selling mail-order hang glider kits to eager pilots. In 1974, the United States Hang Gliding Association had 2,794 members. In that year, there were 40 U.S. hang gliding fatalities. That's one death for every 70 members. By 1975, there had been 110 U.S. deaths from a sport that had been official for less than 4 years.
In those days, it went over big as an act. I was the top paid performer in America for a couple of years. I couldn't fill all the bookings, and bookers would hire anybody that would claim to be a performer. So 17 guys followed me into the fairgrounds, and all 17 are dead. I'm the only one left.
In response to the rash of hang gliding fatalities in the mid-1970s, the USHGA established mandatory glider certifications by their manufacturers. The association also developed an instructor certification program to ensure that those teaching the sport were qualified. As a result, hang gliding fatality statistics don't look anything like the figures of the mid-1970s, though the stigma of those days continues to haunt the sport. Part of this decline is due to great improvements in glider design and construction. Today's gliders are designed to typically withstand as much as 6 positive Gs and 4 negative Gs on their wings. Structural failures, which were frequent in the mid-1970s, are today usually associated only with acrobatic or other extreme flying maneuvers. Like this one, which demonstrates what has become standard equipment for hang glider pilots, the emergency parachute. Having to throw a chute is rare. In a recent year for which data was collected, there were only 10 intentional deployments, and 7 of those followed structural failures resulting from extreme acrobatic maneuvers. But they are a major part of hang gliding's much improved safety record. They'll usually save the pilot's life, even if they don't do it gracefully.
Threw my chute a couple weeks ago, doing aerobatic maneuvers, failed aerobatic maneuver. I was trying to complete a twisty, which basically diving at the ground, throw all your weight to the side, to the left, get adverse yaw in, pitch up, throw all your weight to the right, and it's kind of like a vertical barrel roll. Tumbled about 3 times, we're not sure of the exact number, and at which point the leading edges both broke in half. I was spinning, the glider was oscillating about 90 degrees up and down, and realized my glider smashed. I need to throw my chute. Looked down, pulled it out, threw it. Took a little while. I was probably at about anywhere between 2,000 and 1,500 feet at this point. Touchdown standing on the undersurface of the glider, which is now pointed up, and couldn't have asked for a softer touchdown because the glider was coming down flat as well under canopy. Really slowed my descent and just basically squatted down and absorbed the impact and stood up and unbuckled from my harness.
In most minor crashes, the A-frame control bar acts as a safety cage, absorbing the impact. The aluminum down tubes are easy to replace.
Hang gliding's gone through its growing pains and its idea of how safe it is and so forth. I think it's kind of plateaued on number of people entering the sport. But the safety record, I think, has gotten a lot better, and that's due to the towing and the tandem flying. I think tandem teaching really takes a lot of the dangers out of it. And I still think we need a lot more promotion to the general public to really let them see that it's out there, and that you don't have to be on a sand dune to do it. You don't have to live on the California coast to do it. People view it as an extreme sport. I don't look at it that. It's as safe as any other aviation sport, and just like any other aviation sport, it's not forgiving. So you just got to take your time with it and fly when things are right and not experiment with so much.
You don't want to get into it casually. It's like, well, are you sure you want to do this? Because it's serious stuff. When a human being When you leave the ground, I mean, it suddenly becomes very serious because obviously you can fall. I think that what makes this sport not for everybody, because you get some of those people that are so casual and complacent, and they don't want that level of discipline in their sport. They want it more casual where they don't have to worry about it. So those people go bowling and they play tennis and golf, and that's fine. It's a little harder, takes a little more time, a little more discipline, but geez, we're the only guys that we can say, man, I flew for 4 hours and it was great. I was out there flying with a hawk, or I went through a cloud. I mean, that stuff dreams are made of.
Now on her 14th lesson, Zelda is getting closer to that dream. Steve has her going briefly to the prone position during her scooter toes.
Flare, Zelda, flare! Atta girl.
As for me, my time has now come to soar with the birds. Or the angels, depending on how it goes. Here's how truck towing works. The glider's base tube is mounted onto open brackets on the truck's tailgate. A strap connected to the glider's nose is attached to a quick release mechanism, which is activated by pulling a ring under the base tube. Like scooter towing and aero towing, truck towing uses Spectraline to connect to the pilot. This powered winch holds several thousand feet of it. At peak altitude, the pilot detaches by pulling this little release line. So here we go. At around 35 miles an hour, Steve hits the horn and I pull the ring. Now, my main responsibility is to keep the nose pointed toward the truck. The efficiency of truck tows varies depending on wind direction and other weather factors. On this one, when I pull the release, I'm at 1,150 feet. Now, if I knew anything about thermals and how to stay in them, I could be up here for hours. The longest flight off a single tow at Manquin Flight Park is 4.5 hours, and the altitude record here is more than 7,600 feet. So what should I be trying to find instead of just flying around aimlessly? A good visual example of how thermals work is a lava lamp. The flat, cool lava, in this case, represents a layer of air over the ground at the beginning of the day. The sun heats the ground throughout the morning. The heat obviously doesn't come from below like the lamp, but the idea is the same. The surface below the air is getting hotter, and the air layer gets heated with it. At Manquin Flight Park, the first places for this to happen are the areas that generate the most heat from sunlight, like the freshly planted soybean field. As the field gets hotter, the heated layer of air over it starts to rise, typically taking on a dome or half-bubble shape. Eventually, in what is called a trigger, the thermal pushes up through the cooler air above it and releases to form a bubble. This invisible rising air may also be roughly in the shape of a column, still being fed by air from the ground. Thermals drift with the wind, so one that is triggered here might be over here by the time it reaches 1,000 feet. And since thermals are often independent rising bubbles, a pilot at one altitude might ascend with it for thousands of feet, while a pilot a mere 100 feet lower will miss it entirely. Unfortunately, working a thermal, as they say here, is not as simple as finding a nice warm bubble that will carry you gently into the sky. Thermals are often irregularly shaped and can be smaller than your glider. They rise at different speeds, and their invisible edges are often associated with swirling, chaotic air. Pilots caught in these turbulent edges can be tossed around wildly, and in rare, extreme cases, even flipped upside down. You know when you've found a thermal one of two ways. If it's strong enough, you can feel yourself being thrown upward. Or you can just rely on this instrument, called a variometer, or vario for short. Varios not only display altitude, but whether you're rising or sinking and how fast. So that you don't have to stare at them while flying, varios are usually set to beep if you're in rising air, The more rapidly it beeps, the greater the lift, and sound a brief alarm if you're in sinking air. Otherwise, they stay quiet. The most basic soaring rule, then, is to fly slow through rising air and fast through sinking air. But unless the thermals are huge and everywhere, that won't be enough. Ideally, once a hang glider pilot finds a thermal, they want to circle within it and stay with it as high as it goes. And thermals keep rising until they reach the layer where clouds form, a level known as cloud base. Cloud base varies depending on air temperature, humidity, and dew point, but at Manquin, 6,500 feet is typical. Though thermals are invisible, there are a couple of indicators that hang glider pilots look for. The most common to spot is one or more circling birds. Birds instinctively conserve energy by seeking out and circling in thermals. As I was filming this one, it rose about 500 feet without once flapping its wings. The second is the appearance of cumulus clouds, known in the hang gliding community as cumies. Once a thermal reaches cloud base, the more humid air it is brought up cools, condenses, and becomes visible. If the cloud is just starting to form, there is a good chance that there is still a column of rising air underneath it. There are other types of lift that hang glider pilots can use, but they're based on air being deflected on terrain like ridges, mountains, and valleys. Here amid the flat fields of Manquin, it's thermal lift or nothing. Most of the experienced pilots here will keep themselves occupied until the day's thermal activity has started.
No, 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 no! What did you do that for?
But finding no lift on this flight, and not being experienced enough to stay in it if I did, I have what is called a sled run, essentially being towed up and gliding back down to the ground, which makes me, as hang gliding terminology would have it, a sled dog. As soon as I'm down, I immediately want to go up again and find some lift. I'm ready to soar with the birds like I hear the others talk about.
You know, I was flying in the mountains, and sometimes a hawk will soar the mountain just like you will. He'll stay in the lift band, and you'll be flying and pretty much not paying each other any mind, and you can get closer and closer. And you know, I'm sure he's aware that you're there because you can see him kind of look up at you occasionally, and he's right below me. And then I kind of dove at him, and he did what hawks do. I mean, they react so lightning quick. I mean, he just pulled his wings in and dropped out of the way, and you could just see him falling away, and I was just amazed that he reacted so quick, and I startled him. Actually, I felt a little bit bad because I probably scared him a little bit. I think all hang glider pilots eventually have some encounter with a bird or a hawk or something. I mean, when you're thermaling, you'll have birds right in thermal with you, and I've had them really close where you're like, wow, does that bird even know I'm here? And I'm sure he does, but he's thinking, well, that must be just a bigger bird because you're really not making a lot of noise. I've stolen thermals from birds where I've seen birds flying, and I went over and took a thermal and joined it, and sometimes I've seen them come over to me, actually. That's neat, where, you know, the bird will see you and go, oh, there's some lift, and you'll see them, you'll be flying, and they'll come on underneath of you and then start turning, and you know that they saw you going up, and they're like, well, they want to go up too, and they're like, yeah, it's like some sort of symbiotic, you know, relationship there.
Did you see those circling birds at the end of the tow road?
Yeah, you flew straight towards me and flew right with them. There was a couple of them there, but was there any lift there when you got there?
No, but I chased them out. I thought maybe they had found a thermal or something.
Yeah, they fuck with us. Oh, yeah. Good job, Zelda. I'll tell you what, Joe, she's on top of it.
It was so great to see her go. And I tell you, it was one of the most perfect tows. She took off, and we were most worried about her on tow. I didn't want to get her in a turn, have her like panic and just you know, get into a turn and like have to release. And she towed up so perfectly straight. I mean, I could not believe the glider was, and she went up to about 1,000 feet. Saw her release, and oh my God, she's doing it.
The tow was straight. I was right over the truck, man. I didn't move that far. I I was like, oh, I didn't move that far. I was like, okay, I'm just going to stay right there, right over your truck.
And she landed, and she didn't have a perfect landing, although she landed on her feet.
Okay.
Kind of ran it out, you know?
Yeah.
And then she came back here, and man, talk about multiple orgasms. It hit her afterwards. She was like calm, and she ran back to the truck, and then she got off, and it was like, she started quivering. It was like, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. It was like, oh, back up, everybody, man. It was like the Tasmanian devil, you know? She was walking around, she felt like this tall, man. She was like, I am Zelda, I can fly. And we were like, Zelda, Zelda.
I mean, the flying was great.
Wasn't it?
The flying was just so perfect. And it was just so neat. I just kind of went, oh my gosh, this is so cool. I could do this, I could do this.